She was not born in England. She had crossed the North Sea from Sweden as a young woman, leaving everything she knew behind, chasing the possibility of a better life in London. She had survived things that would have broken most people: a shipwreck, the death of her husband, the loss of her children, years of poverty in a city that had no particular interest in what happened to foreign women who fell through its cracks. By 1888, she was living in Whitechapel, surviving the only way available to her, in a lodging house on Flower and Dean Street, among women whose stories were as hard as her own. On the night of September 30th, 1888, she was seen dancing in the kitchen of that lodging house, laughing. A few hours later, she was dead. Her name was Elisabeth Stride. The world called her Long Liz. And this is her real story. This is Crime Archive, Episode 3 of The Women of Whitechapel. Elisabeth Gustafsdotter was born on November 27th, 1843, in Stora Tumlehed, a small parish near Gothenburg on the west coast of Sweden. Her father was a farmer. Her childhood was rural, modest, and shaped by the rhythms of Swedish country life. She was one of several children in a family that worked hard and expected the same from everyone around them. As a young woman, Elisabeth moved to Gothenburg, the city, and registered as a domestic servant. She was in her late teens. She was ambitious enough to leave the farm and independent enough to believe she could build something better than the life she had been born into. In 1865, she gave birth to a stillborn daughter. She was unmarried. In mid-Victorian Sweden, this carried significant social stigma, enough to close doors, end friendships, and make a young woman's future in a city where everyone knew her business, deeply uncertain and uncomfortable. 2 years later, in 1866, she made a decision that tells you everything about the kind of woman Elisabeth Gustafsdotter was. She emigrated to England, not to a neighboring Swedish town, not to Stockholm, to England, across the North Sea, to a city she had never seen, in a language she barely spoke, among people who had no particular reason to welcome or help her. She was 23 years old. She knew almost nobody, and she was starting completely from nothing in one of the largest and most overwhelming cities in the world. Elisabeth, now going by Elisabeth, initially found work as a domestic servant in London, which was the most accessible employment available to immigrant women with limited English. In 1869, she married a carpenter named John Thomas Stride at a church in Whitechapel. It is a detail worth pausing on. The woman who would eventually become one of Whitechapel's most famous victims was married in Whitechapel, nearly 20 years before the night that history would remember her for. She had a life there, a history there. Whitechapel was not just the place where she died. It was the place where she had once tried to build something. She and John Stride ran a coffee shop for a period in Poplar, East London. It was a modest venture, but it represented something. Two people trying to establish themselves, trying to build a livelihood, trying to be more than survivors. But the marriage struggled, the coffee shop closed, and by the late 1870s, Elisabeth and John Stride had separated. Elisabeth Stride told people a story about herself that was not true. She claimed that her husband and 2 of her children had drowned in the Princess Alice disaster of 1878, one of the worst maritime disasters in British history, in which over 650 people died when a pleasure steamer sank on the Thames. The story was not accurate. John Stride did not die in the Princess Alice disaster. He died in a workhouse in 1884, 6 years after the sinking, from entirely unrelated causes. Elisabeth Stride had invented a tragedy to explain her circumstances. And here is what that tells us, not about dishonesty, but about desperation. In Victorian England, a separated woman with no husband and no income had almost no legitimate claim on charity or sympathy. But a widow who had lost her family in a famous disaster was a different story entirely. Elisabeth Stride was not lying for gain. She was constructing a survival narrative in a world that offered almost nothing to women like her without one. By 1888, Elisabeth was living on Flower and Dean Street, one of the most notorious addresses in Whitechapel, a street so densely packed with lodging houses and desperate people that police referred to it as one of the most dangerous in London. She had a long-term partner, a waterside labourer named Michael Kidney, with whom she had an on and off relationship that was by all accounts difficult and volatile. They separated and reconciled multiple times over several years. The relationship was not a stable one, but it was the closest thing to a consistent human connection that Elisabeth Stride had in Whitechapel. In the weeks before her death, Elisabeth had been drinking heavily. She had appeared before Thames Magistrates' Court for being drunk and disorderly. She was struggling in ways that were visible to the people around her. And yet, on the evening of September 29, 1888, the people in her lodging house on Flower and Dean Street remembered her differently. She was in the kitchen. She was laughing. She was helping to clean the rooms, work she hadn't been asked to do, work she had simply decided to take on. Someone remembered her singing quietly to herself as she moved around the kitchen. Think about what that means. A woman who had been drinking heavily, who had been in court for disorderly behavior, who was living in one of the most desperate lodging houses in Whitechapel, and on her last evening alive she was singing in the kitchen and helping her neighbours. That is the Elisabeth Stride that history almost never shows. And it is the one worth remembering. The night of September 30th, 1888, was unusual in the Jack the Ripper case for one specific reason. It was the night of what investigators would later call the double event. 2 women were killed in the same night, within approximately 45 minutes of each other, in 2 different locations less than a mile apart. Elisabeth Stride was the first. At approximately 12:35 in the morning, a man named William Marshall saw Elisabeth standing on Berner Street talking to a man. He described the man as middle-aged, stout, wearing a small black coat. At approximately 12:45, a police constable named William Smith saw Elisabeth on the same street with a man carrying a parcel wrapped in newspaper. At approximately 1 a.m., a man named Israel Schwartz turned into Berner Street and witnessed something that would become one of the most debated observations in the entire Ripper investigation. Schwartz saw a man stop and speak to a woman standing in a gateway. The man tried to pull her into the street. She resisted. He threw her down onto the pavement. She screamed 3 times. Schwartz, frightened, crossed to the other side of the street and kept walking. Minutes later, Elisabeth Stride was found dead in that same gateway by a man named Louis Schwartz, whose horse and cart had turned into Berner Street at just after 1 a.m. The horse shied away from something on the ground. Schwartz looked down. Elisabeth Stride was lying against the wall, her throat cut, her body still warm. But here is the detail that separates Elisabeth Stride's murder from the others. Her body had not been mutilated. Investigators, and ripperologists ever since, have debated whether Schwartz's arrival interrupted the killer before he could complete what he had started, which would mean that Louis Schwartz and his horse arrived in Berner Street within minutes, possibly seconds, of the murder taking place, and that the killer was still there when he arrived. Elisabeth Stride was identified by Michael Kidney, the partner she had separated from and reconciled with so many times. Whatever the complications of their relationship, he came to the mortuary. He stood before her and confirmed who she was. That act of identification, quiet, unglamorous, and unreported by most accounts of this case, was the last thing anyone did for Elisabeth Stride that acknowledged her as a person rather than a victim. She was also identified by a woman who had known her from the lodging houses of Flower and Dean Street, someone who had shared that world with her and recognized her face. Back in Sweden, in the small rural parish of Stora Tumlehed, where a farmer's daughter had once decided the world was bigger than the life she had been given, there was a family who had watched Elisabeth leave for England more than 20 years earlier. They had watched her go, and they had perhaps wondered, in the way that families wonder about the ones who leave, whether England had been good to her, whether the news of her death ever crossed the North Sea to reach them, whether they ever knew what had become of Elisabeth Gustafsdotter. The records do not tell us with certainty. What we know is that on the night of September 30th, within 45 minutes of Elisabeth Stride's death, Catherine Eddowes was killed less than a mile away. 2 women, 1 night, 1 killer who was interrupted at one scene and immediately found another. The investigation found nothing that led to an arrest, and Elisabeth Stride, the Swedish farmer's daughter who had crossed an ocean, survived a shipwreck, built a story to survive, and been seen laughing in a kitchen just hours before she died, became the 3rd name on a list the world would remember under someone else's. Elisabeth Stride was 44 years old when she died in Dutfield's yard on Berner Street. She had been born in a small Swedish parish and died in a Whitechapel alley. Between those 2 points she had crossed an ocean, married, built a business, survived loss after loss, and constructed a story about herself that was more survival than deception. She had laughed in a lodging house kitchen on the last night of her life. She had screamed 3 times in a gateway while a man watched from across the street and kept walking. And she had died while a horse and cart turned into a dark yard, possibly seconds too late to save her. Her name was Elisabeth Stride. Remember it. Next week on The Women of Whitechapel, Catherine Eddowes, released from jail at 1 a.m., dead less than an hour later. The woman whose story opened this entire series. Comment the word mysteries below if Elisabeth's story moved you, and subscribe to Crime Archive so you don't miss a single episode, because every one of these women deserves to be more than a number. Crime Archive. Some files never close.